Stella, welcome to 7:30.
Good evening.
Now, Julian Assange has an appeal tomorrow before the UK High Court. What is it that you are hoping for?
Well, look, if Julian loses this round, there is no possibility of further appeal in the United Kingdom. It has happened in other cases that once there is a final decision like this, the extraditee has been put on a plane within 24 hours. So this is an extremely high-risk moment, and the stakes could not be higher.
And realistically, what are your expectations for the appeal that you are planning to begin with tomorrow?
Well, it's going to be a 2-day appeal. It is actually a renewal hearing. What we are trying to do is for the British High Court to hear Julian's full appeal, because actually it is his application for leave to appeal which was rejected, which we are now trying to get overturned so that he can have his arguments heard in full before the court. But if he's successful this time round, that would just mean that he would have an appeal, a full appeal, 8 to 10 months down the line.
Now, in the last appeal, the US did provide a set of assurances about how Julian would be treated if he were extradited to the United States. Why are those assurances, notwithstanding that this is a terrifying prospect for you, I understand that, but why were those assurances given by the US government not enough?
Look, Amnesty International looked at the wording of the assurances and said that they were not worth the paper they were written on. When you look at the actual wording, these are qualified assurances, and that they are essentially a license to put Julian in precisely the types of conditions that the court said would drive him to commit suicide. You have to understand that this is an Espionage Act prosecution, so the agencies, the CIA, the FBI, determine the conditions that the person is being held in. It's not a regular Department of Prisons decision. So they take their advice from the CIA, and this is, of course, the agency that plotted to murder Julian under the Trump administration. So Julian will never be safe in a US prison. That is, there's no question about it. We know that there are elections coming up in the United States. He will simply never be safe if he is in US custody.
Are there any circumstances under which Julian would plead guilty or accept responsibility for those things which he's accused of in order to avoid these conditions that you're describing, that is, to avoid extradition?
Well, look, the only thing that he would be pleading to is journalism. He is being accused of receiving information from a source, information that was in the public interest, that belonged in the public. And the US is actually engaged in an admission that they now criminalize journalism. That is the case that has been brought against Julian. Journalism has been reclassed as espionage. An unprecedented prosecution has been taken against a publisher for the very first time in the more than 100 years history of this act. And it is going to set a precedent. It already is setting a precedent that can then be used against the rest of the press anywhere in the world.
So I just want to ask you this question. In the indictment that the US authorities presented to the UK authorities, they are accusing Julian Assange of conspiracy with Chelsea Manning, aren't they? Not just the act of publication?
The conspiracy is to publish. That is their allegation. If you look at the indictment, they refer to a conspiracy to publish. Investigative journalists have to be able to communicate with their sources, and if the object of the conspiracy is to publish, then this should not be classed as a crime. But as I said, the United States has crossed a legal Rubicon by classifying journalistic activity as espionage and treating the public as the enemy.
I just want to ask you why you think it is that President Biden, who was, of course, the vice president under Barack Obama when Chelsea Manning's sentence was commuted, leading to her early departure from prison. Why is the now President Joe Biden continuing with this case against Julian Assange?
Well, this is really a very good question. This is Donald Trump's most dangerous and lasting legacy, and the Biden administration has continued it. And I don't have an answer to why. The New York Times, the Washington Post, all the press freedom organizations, Amnesty International, you name it, all say that this is the greatest threat to press freedom globally, and also an existential threat to the First Amendment. 35 law professors just wrote a couple of days ago to Attorney General Merrick Garland saying precisely that this case can be the end of First Amendment protections. And there's never been a case like it before. And of course, it will be used in the future against other publishers, other journalists in the US and abroad.
Let me ask you about the Australian government's role here, because last week, the Australian Parliament passed a motion calling on the UK and the US to resolve this case. Does the Australian government have any real leverage or influence in this matter?
Absolutely, and I'm extremely grateful to all the parliamentarians that backed the resolution. It sends a very clear signal that not just the Australian people, but also the Australian Parliament are backing the government. It strengthens Prime Minister Albanese's hand in his negotiations and in his conversations with the US government. This case, of course, is politically motivated. It came about in the context of an administration that was trying to find a way to hit back at the press and threaten the press and intimidate journalists everywhere. So with the backing, such a clear endorsement by Parliament and by the Australian people, of course, without which this resolution would not have come about, the Prime Minister Albanese can have talks with more strength in his hand.
Now, I know that you've seen Julian in prison recently with your children, but I just want to keep that connection alive with Australia. Do you know what Julian Assange would say to Anthony Albanese about what he could do in the period of time that lies ahead of us?
He would say, "Prime Minister, save my life." The situation right now with Julian is so critical, he could be bundled into a plane within days of the decision. The decision could come down this very week. Once he's in US custody, he's going to be put in the deepest, darkest hole in the US prison system, and it will be much harder for him to be freed. He cannot survive more time in prison. He needs to be released, and I think we've heard enough is enough for 3 years now. Let's be clear, Julian needs to be released from prison, and he needs to be released now.
Stella, Assange obviously will be watching extremely closely. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thank you.